Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. I'm Jordan Arocha and today I'm joined by Walker Lee. Today we're going to be looking at the all-new 2025 Rivian R1S. And by all new, there's a lot of stuff that's still the same, right? They did a lot of updates that we're going to take a look at. Frankly, some updates that over this period of time, I'm pretty impressed that they were able to pull the trigger on and move forward with. So we're going to look at some of those updates. We've got our older Rivian here. We were walking over to the A-frames, taking a look at some stuff to compare notes. So we'll look at some of that stuff as we get underbody. But really quick, before we do that, I just kind of wanted to bring us under the vehicle, take a look at the architecture here, and I'll point out just some major monuments to orient the folks as far as what it is that we're looking at. Okay, so coming underbody here, we've got our cast aluminum subframe, we've got our lower control arms. This whole assembly is built much like a unibody from the cradle perspective, but if you've watched any of our previous Rivian videos, you know that they also have a separate frame. So it's like one of those really interesting versions of a vehicle where it's both body on frame and unibody, depending on which part of the vehicle that you look at. So very interesting. And we'll point out some interesting executions or specific ways that they tackled some of these things underbody in a bit. Over here we've got a large fixed piston caliper hanging off the cast aluminum knuckle here. So this is a pretty hefty brake system, right? This vehicle tips the scales in a pretty major way relative to some of its vehicles. Like it looks roughly the size of a Grand Cherokee. This is considerably heavier than that. Above that, if you're looking at these braided steel lines, might be something like you see in like a performance application, or for you plumbers out there, something that you might see actually under your sink if you went in for the braided steel. But what these are actually is for the strut and the shock absorber assembly that you're seeing right here. So going from this bolt and lower control arm all the way to the top, these are hydraulic lines. So what this is part of Rivian's active hydraulic air suspension system. So they're one of the few OEMs out there really that I've ever seen in any sort of volume production where they have two types of systems within their suspension. So they both have a active hydraulic system that's really going to modulate the stiffness and damping characteristics of those shock absorbers. And then in addition to that, they've got an air system which is largely responsible for raising and lowering the vehicle. So one is predominantly going to give you really that vehicle carrying and ride height, which is the air. And then the hydraulics are really going to give you the differences in damping characteristics, right? What you actually kind of sense at high or low speeds driving the vehicle. As we go rearward, you're seeing the underside of the electric drive unit, right? EDM, AKA. So this is where their new motor, and if you haven't seen that, we did do a teardown video on that, the motor and gearbox versus their previously sourced from Bosch setup where they had the dual motor in the front. So this is all new from Rivian. We did get a chance to take a look at that, so please go ahead and take a look at the video we did on that some time ago earlier in the year. And then as we move a bit further rearward, we're seeing some of the shear plates, underbody sort of armoring for the battery pack, some of the high voltage cables. And really, and I'll probably hand it over to Walker in just a moment, a lot of these areas that I just touched on, we're actually seeing pretty measurable and significant changes as compared to the original version of the R1S that we saw come in. So maybe with that being said, Walker, if you want to take us through some of the observations that we made looking underbody, I think there's some interesting dialogue to have.
Yeah, sure. We could start at the front of the vehicle and kind of walk our way back again. I think the first and most obvious thing that when you're looking under the vehicle has changed is the cradle itself. So we have the original cradle from the vehicle that we tore down here on the floor. Maybe we could look at that first. And so it's comprised of mainly a lot of extrusions, a lot of stamped aluminum, but a lot of welding operations to get this whole assembly together. And when we looked at it originally, I think it was a little surprising to some of us, especially when you see that the rear of the cradle already was leveraging some castings and just connecting those two castings with extrusions cross car. And so that's pretty typical. But this was kind of the extreme in terms of extrusions and a lot of stampings for their front cradle. So we were pleased when we looked at this one that a lot of that has been reduced, and now we just have a single piece cradle that has all your molded and attachment features for your lower control arms as well as a lot of provisions for the EDM itself to mount to, and it's even picking up some of the radiator that you can't quite see, but up here. So one of the benefits of a casting is that it really enables you to get a lot of the complexity into a single part, and allows you to get perches and mounts for all these various components in a pretty tight area. So we were pleased to see that. I guess moving further backwards, it seems like most of the control arms themselves are not changed. I know that Jordan in particular, you were looking at hoping maybe this lower would have been a little bit more optimized, but it looks like they're still doing a lot of machining on it that could have been included in the original part itself. Moving outboard though, it does look like the knuckle itself has changed. We have the original one that I can grab here. Naturally, maybe we need to move to the other side. But if we look at this, just comparing it side by side, a lot of the notable changes that we see are really at the bottom interface here. And so you can see the amount of material itself that's basically been removed on the new version. As you make your way further upwards, it seems to be more traditional and carry over, but I think the biggest notable difference we saw was really at this bottom interface here.
Yeah, and then also from optimization perspective, it looks like where possible, they fully opened up this pocket, right? They had a recessed sort of Dorito shape there in the original version, and now they're actually starting to open some of that out. So in some of that you might see, you might say, well, why didn't Rivian take that out in the beginning? Could be one of several reasons, but you know, in some instances, there's a level of margin that you want to have for these, you know, durability tests to make sure that you're not going to have any catastrophic failures going into production, right? And so, in contrary to what people may think, right, some of these durability cycles, they extend past job one, right, the first vehicle off the production line. You look at the timelines and those will overlap, meaning you'll get to job one, the first production artifacts are going to roll off, the properties are going to roll off the line, and you still have yet some durability testing to do. So what we're seeing when we see post job one, you know, reductions in material or seeming to be, you know, optimizations, especially with structural items, often that is based on or predicated on additional durability cycles or verifications of sorts where they're saying, check, we can go ahead and get rid of that now. And in other times, like with this cast example here, they're running fast in the beginning. The extrusions that we saw in the original version are much more conducive to rapid changes, low investment costs with an extrusion tool versus a large press and a machined tool to get the die casting in. For example, this looks like it may be like a low pressure permanent mold perhaps, die cast. So from a tooling perspective, the extrusions are great, the go fast strategy, but this is so nice in terms of the high volume efficiency to manufacture. We're talking about, you know, 25 plus individual parts on this between all the extrusions, some of the inserts, some of the stampings and so forth, versus mostly a single part on this casting, right? And sure, they have to do some machining, no doubt, right, to manage their eccentric pockets here for the suspension adjustments, as well as some of the attachments. But I mean, considerably less than what we would see on the extrusions, which also, by the way, have a lot of machining involved.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of my favorite things about kind of walking through cars like this is that, you know, both parts could be right for different applications. And so that could have been right from the beginning when they maybe were less confident or had lower volume. That lended itself well to that application maybe. But I think this certainly makes sense now with where they're at. They're pretty established. They're going to be around. They're ramping their volume up. And so I think this is just the right direction for them to go at this point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is interesting. So when we're looking at this and we're looking at a split joint attaching to a motor mount, which is suspending this EDM in space, right? There's elastomeric mounts here. Oftentimes what you'll see in an ICE vehicle, internal combustion application, is you'll see, like the Germans used to do this a lot, the F10 generation 5 Series, BMW 5 Series. They had their whole cradle and powertrain mounted in such a way that in an impact, front end impact, the cradle and everything else had a ramped feature at the trailing end of it, so that when it would shear off, it would bring the powertrain and everything with it into the tunnel to keep it from going directly into the dash panel. And I think what's happening here, based on how this is all assembled and all these angles, especially with this split joint, is I think what they're trying to do is have the the motor mounts stay rigid, stay connected to the body, meaning the motor is going to stay in position. And then they're allowing this split joint with this ramp to decouple from the powertrain, go downward and rearward to really maximize any free crush space that they garner in a dynamic sense, as well as to limit the powertrain travel into the occupant home. So, and we're sort of piecing this together as we're looking through this. But to me, just based on the way it's set up, I think that's in part what they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to decouple the two and get the cradle separate on a different plane from the powertrain and get that rearward. So Walker, the other thing separate from the cradle that we talked about as we went further rearward, why don't you talk a bit about the whole transition from like the front suspension cradle powertrain to the battery and what you saw differently?
Yeah, I definitely think that we're noticing a lot more structure built back in, specifically basically starting at the trailing edge of their cradle. We're seeing now what looks to be two shear plates with a bunch of spot welds tying them together, interfacing between the front cradle and where we're starting to meet into our battery pack as we go further rearward. These were both unique, and it looks like, we were having some conversations before we turned the cameras on that it is interesting that they're two separate parts. We're not sure whether they were maybe at one point designed as a single part and they needed to add more structure back in, and far enough down the design road, they had to add this second reinforcement as a late add, or maybe they're doing something clever with it and trying to get it to shear in a certain way. And they need to be two separate parts. Not clear at this time, but.
Yeah, and as we went rearward, we saw certain versions of the R1T, for example, this whole area in the underbody had a, I don't know, it was a 5 or 6 segment multi-piece aluminum extruded bed, right? It had open cells in between for a bit of free crush space, but a pretty significant plate in order to protect the battery. And then the bottom of the battery tray had a carbon fiber, like a resin reinforced sheet, incremental to that. So a lot of armoring, if you want to call it that, between the ground plane here, right, where you're going to encounter debris and you want to break over angle type stuff, off-roading and so forth, between that and the battery pack. Here, it looks like they went to a mostly composite or perhaps like an overmolded strategy here. So it's kind of difficult to make out, right? But one thing's for sure, it is not magnetic. So actually, what I think we might try and do is get some better views from the side, but I think this may be an overmolded aluminum, which is a pretty drastic departure from what we saw on the previous iteration. So more to come on that. But I would go back to the same comments and dialogue that we had with the cradle, which are, I like what I'm seeing just in that, like with Tesla, we're seeing pretty significant architecture, suspension changes, underbody shielding. All these require new capital investment, new tooling, new sourcing perhaps. You need to go and validate all of that. They're making pretty, impactful changes to this vehicle in fairly short amounts of time. And some of that, certainly is driven by necessity. You, as a company like Rivian, you go for an IPO, and then it's a race to the finish line to get to a point where you're profitable. Your actual product has a profit margin. And when you do things like the extruded aluminum cradle that we're seeing in the background, those things from a piece cost perspective at volume are going to make it really hard to get your BOM cost down, your bill of material cost down, to maintain a viable product in the market. Yep. Okay, what do you say we move to the rear? Yeah, a lot of aluminum control arms, multi-link suspension, right? Same, air spring, separate shock absorbers. So in the front, conversely, where you saw the air spring and the hydraulic shock absorber being one, these are separate. But again, not a major departure at all from what we saw in the previous generation Rivian. But, you're seeing, you might say, well, man, boy, that's a lot of aluminum. It certainly looks cool. It's definitely a lightweight option. But a lot of this aluminum right in this vehicle is not necessarily, hey, let's go to aluminum for corrosion. They're trying to combat the pretty sizable weight that they're carrying around via battery pack, right?
Yeah. I think one of the other things, you were talking to their, some of their strategies in terms of managing, the typically cars will have sway bars, and they're able to get away without using a sway bar entirely by using this hydraulic setup that they have. And so I think that's one of the areas that you're definitely getting a lot for your money with this car. And I think that's one of the areas that I always notice it. I think the cradle itself, like we talked about, so this is actually a case where it looks like they're carrying over the same cradle that we saw in the first. And so when we were looking at it before, you notice that a lot of the complexity, a lot of where the mounts are, they do these cast sections that are basically mirrored from left-hand to right-hand sides. And then they just use these extrusions to mount them across car. And that's pretty typical. This is what I think we would have liked to see more of on the front cradle in Gen 1. And now we're seeing them take this actually to even more of an extreme by not even having these extrusions run cross car and actually just integrating those into the casting itself. Yeah. Another difference that we noticed as we're moving more rearward, this rearmost plastic shield that kind of blends in with the rear fascia, I believe this was like a carbon fiber reinforced plastic before, and now unclear whether it's injection molded or thermoformed, but it looks to be a more typical resin, whether that's TPO or polypropylene. But it looks like they're going away from more of these premium carbon fiber plastics.
Yeah. Yeah, the one thing that's sort of interesting to me, Walker, you were talking about the carryover cradle. That's a big feat, right? A big hurdle to tackle when putting in a all new rear motor setup. So as an example, when I heard and when we started to get wind that they're going to go all new motors, we're going away from Bosch, we're going from quad motor to dual motor setup at a vehicle level. In my head immediately, I'm like, okay, well, that's a new rear cradle. That's it, right? I start walking through all the things that are going to be brand new, and surprisingly, they were able to make a rather. It's pretty impressive how common the rear cradle is, given that the powertrain has changed over wholesale.
Yeah, normally you'd at least be expecting to see like intermediate brackets, kind of blending those two components together, right, where it seems like pretty typical from what we saw in the first version.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that you had noticed in regards to the motors itself is, I believe before we had more of like a PUR NVH insulator, so what's surrounding the EDM itself and trying to get a lot of the noise out of the cabin, where now it looks like there is still some foam, so we have multi-layer, so we have like a foam inner, but the outside is all this TPO hard shell. I don't know if that was a cost save, we haven't costed it out, or it could be that they're trying to have a hard outer shell to kind of keep a lot of the dirt and debris off of the PUR that would typically absorb some of that material. So not clear which direction they're going at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, just from the sciences perspective, from an NVH perspective, looking at these insulators, the rule of thumb is a higher, a harder durometer, so something that is more like metallic in nature to the touch, a hard piece, is going to be better for higher frequencies, so those real high frequency motor noises. And something softer, more pliable, something like a foam, is going to be better for lower frequencies. So the other thing that this could be helping them do is really mitigate multiple or a broader range of frequencies being driven by this motor coming into the cabin. So as we're talking about a lot of the commonality in the rear, and that is impressive in terms of how common they've been able to keep it. Going back to the same narrative as the front, how quickly they're changing and the elements of the vehicle that they're willing to change. Walker, you pointed something out on the battery pack when we looked under here. Talk to us about one of the big changes that we're seeing on the battery pack from what we can see.
Yeah, so this is a pretty big change from what we saw in the first generation. So this is the rear face of the battery pack, and what you're seeing here is this entire face is a giant casting. And so what that enables them to do is basically, where previously this was an extruded face with a bunch of machining operations for all these various connectors and vents and coolant lines, now they have, again, a highly integrated part with basically it looks like some structural adhesive, where they're basically bonding their casting to the rest of what would probably still be a highly extruded battery pack, but we haven't actually seen it dropped. But it looks like within a very short period of time, they went and made a pretty significant change to the overall battery pack structure.
Yeah. And some of the things that we may have been a bit critical on, and I think rightfully so, looking at the first iteration of the Rivian, where they had all that, essential like RTV and butyl, right, pasted all over the back end of this, trying to seal out the extrusion from the greater battery pack. Most of that is gone now, right? So most of that is quite clean in terms of their sealing strategy between the battery pack and the casting. Kudos to Rivian for going through and really cleaning up the whole back end of this, and for themselves really optimizing the way that everything's attaching here, saving space and casting in channels for tool access right to the modules back here. I'm pretty impressed to see how quickly they're moving on this.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see, the rest of the pack. The front end's a lot more shielded than the rear end, so I'd be curious to see, typically that front face even has more complexity than this back face. So I'd be curious, how far they're taking this strategy both on the exterior of the battery pack, but also, intra-pack.
Yeah. If the changes that we're seeing are any indication of the iceberg below, I think we should try and get this battery pack dropped and take a look at some more stuff. But all in all, I would say they're doing quite a bit in a very short amount of time. So kudos to Rivian. Yeah. Other than that, folks, I know we've got some other reviews coming, right? We're going to do interior, we're going to do a broader view of the whole vehicle. So stay tuned, and we've got some other folks that'll join you for that. But Walker, thanks for helping take us through this. And until next time, we'll talk to you. Reach out at sales@leandesign.com if you need anything. Thank you.